200 acres at Diddley Squat sat empty this year. No wheat, no barley, nothing at all. And that sounds simple. It is not simple. Because when a farmer leaves that much land unplanted, the instinct is to assume something has gone wrong. A bad season, a broken plan, a failure somewhere in the chain. But that is not what happened here. And that is why this story matters. Jeremy Clarkson did not leave those acres empty because he could not be bothered. He did not do it because the weather defeated him. He did not do it because the soil suddenly stopped working. He did it because the numbers did not work. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. People hear empty acres and think waste. Farmers hear it and ask a different question. What would it have cost to plant? What would it have returned? And what would have been left after everything was paid? That is the real test. On 27 July, Clarkson wrote that 200 acres at Diddley Squat would stay unplanted this year. Not partially planted. Not trial planted. Not hedged with a hopeful compromise. Left alone. That is an uncomfortable sentence for anyone outside farming. But inside farming, it is brutally familiar. Because land does not become valuable just because you can see it. It becomes valuable only when the crop on it clears its costs. And if it does not, the field becomes a liability with nicer scenery. That is what most headlines missed. They saw the emptiness. They missed the calculation. British wheat was not in collapse when Clarkson made that decision. The market was not dead. The price was not negligible. That is what makes this so revealing. Because if the price had crashed, nobody would be surprised. If the market had been broken, nobody would ask questions. Everyone would shrug and say, yes, of course, he left it empty. But that is not what happened. The price was strong enough to tempt planting. Strong enough to make ordinary people think a farmer would surely take the risk. Strong enough to make the decision look irrational from the outside. And yet Clarkson still passed. That tells you something important. Not about Clarkson the TV personality, about Clarkson the operator. He looked at the land, the costs, the likely yield, the market, and the risk. Then he decided the smartest move was to do nothing. That is not laziness. That is not defeat. That is a spreadsheet beating romance. And that is why this story is bigger than one farm. The real story is the squeeze in British arable farming. Not one dramatic collapse. Not one catastrophic shock. A pressure system, seed, fertilizer, diesel, labor, machinery, finance. Every one of those inputs keeps pushing. And when all of them rise together, even a decent wheat price starts to feel fragile. That is the part outsiders rarely understand. A high selling price does not guarantee profit. Revenue is not the same thing as margin. A crop can sell well and still lose money. A field can look productive and still be a bad business decision. A season can look busy and still end in red ink. That is the trap. Clarkson saw the trap and stepped around it. And once he did, the empty acres became less of a scandal and more of a signal. Because a signal is exactly what this is. It says that on some land, in some years, the smartest arable decision is not to plant. It says the crop is no longer automatically the best use of the ground. It says the economics have changed enough that leaving land bare can be rational. That is the kind of line that makes people uncomfortable. And it should. Because it cuts against everything romantic people like to believe about farming. That every field should produce. That idle land means failure. That good farmers always plant. Sometimes the most professional thing a farmer can do is stop. Not because the land is dead. Because the numbers are alive. And this is where the story turns from one farm into a wider warning. If one of Britain's most famous and best resourced farms cannot justify planting every acre, what does that say about everyone else? That question is not rhetorical. It is the whole point. Because Clarkson is not operating from the same place as most farmers. He has the TV money. He has the media attention. He has the farm shop. He has the pub. He has the brewery. Those are not small advantages. They are what make Diddley Squat survive in a way most farms cannot. The farm shop turned spectators into customers. The pub turned visitors into spenders. The brewery turned a brand into another revenue stream. The television show turned the whole place into a story the country kept watching. That is the flywheel. It is not a farm. It is a flywheel. And once you see it that way, the 200 empty acres make even more sense. Clarkson is not relying on arable wheat alone. He can afford to ask whether a field should grow food, or whether it should do something else. That is a modern business question, not a sentimental one, a survival one. And it is exactly why this decision matters beyond the farm gates. Because what Clarkson did privately, many farmers are now thinking about publicly. Maybe not with 200 acres, maybe not with the same visibility, but with the same logic. If the costs stay high and the margins stay thin, fields will be judged differently. Some will remain in food production, some will be reassigned, some will drift toward other uses because the math will not allow sentiment to win. That is not a theory. That is how land use changes. Slowly. One decision at a time. No announcement. No dramatic policy speech. Just a farmer looking at a field and asking, is this really the best thing this ground can do? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is no. And if the answer is no, the land does not care about tradition. The land cares about returns. That is the hard truth underneath the story. The public reaction also told its own story. Some people laughed. Some people treated it like another Clarkson stunt. Some people assumed he was making a point for effect. But farmers saw something else. They saw recognition. Because they know what it means to make a decision like that. They know what it means to look at a crop and decide the risk is too high. They know what it means to work through the season and still end up with too little margin. That is why this story landed. It was not just a celebrity anecdote. It was the sort of decision thousands of farmers have considered quietly. Clarkson simply said it where everyone could hear. And the moment he did, the phrase empty acres stopped being about emptiness. It became about discipline. That is the real pivot. Not, why did he give up, but why would anyone plant if the economics are this weak? That is a very different question, and it is the right one. Because the biggest mistake people make when they look at modern farming is assuming the land is the main asset. It is not. The economics are the main asset. Land without margin is just land. Land with margin is a business. That distinction changes everything. And when you apply it to diddly squat, the story becomes clear. The farm is not running on tradition alone. It is running on a mix of attention, diversification, and ruthless economic judgment. The empty acres are part of that judgment. They say the old assumption no longer holds. They say not every acre should be forced into wheat. They say the most profitable thing you can sometimes grow is nothing. That line will annoy people. Good, it should. Because the line is doing real work. The failure is the product. That is not a slogan. It is a warning. When the cost of producing a crop is too close to the value of that crop, the business model itself becomes fragile. And once fragility enters the system, farmers stop thinking like romantics and start thinking like operators. What is the best use of this land? What earns? What loses? What can be dropped? What has to stay? Those are the questions that decide the future of British farming, not the ones that make the best newspaper headline. Clarkson's empty acres matter because they strip away the comforting story. They force the conversation back to margins, risk, and return. And for a lot of people, that is much harder to talk about than a bad harvest. Because a bad harvest is temporary. A bad model is structural. That is the difference. And once you see that difference, the empty field starts to look less like a failure and more like a diagnosis. A diagnosis of a system under pressure. A system where food production is no longer automatically the most profitable use of land. That is why this story should worry everyone who cares about British farming. Not because Clarkson left 200 acres empty, but because the logic behind that choice is not unique to Clarkson. It can spread. One field becomes 2, 2 becomes 10, 10 becomes a pattern. And if the pattern keeps growing, the future of arable farming will not be shaped by slogans or outrage. It will be shaped by arithmetic. That is what this really is. Arithmetic with consequences. Stand back and look at the full picture. 200 acres empty. High input costs. A crop that can still fail to justify itself even at a decent price. A farm shop, pub, brewery, and television machine holding up the broader business. And a farmer who looked at the whole thing and chose not to force a loss. That is not a farming accident. That is strategy. And the land only looks empty if you think food was the only option. It wasn't. It was a machine deciding where value lived. And for once, the machine said nothing. If you have made it this far, subscribe for more breakdowns like this. And I want to hear your view. If those 200 acres were yours, Would you have planted them anyway, or left them empty too? If you are watching from a farm, a town, or anywhere in the world, drop your answer in the comments. Thank you for watching.